U.S. budget system is no longer fit for purpose under Donald Trump. Republican fears that the U.S. budget system is no longer fit for purpose under Donald Trump have intensified in Washington, where GOP senators spent this week in the Capitol scrambling to end a 2-month shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security and warning that Democrats could force even broader government closures later this year. The immediate crisis centers on the partial shutdown of Homeland Security, which has already become the longest in the department's history, surpassing last autumn's 43-day federal shutdown driven by a separate fight over healthcare subsidies. This time, the flashpoint is immigration enforcement. Democrats have resisted long-term funding for immigration and customs enforcement and the Border Patrol while Trump is in the White House, and Republicans now concede they are braced for another showdown in September, just weeks before Americans vote. Senate Majority Leader John Thune is trying to wrest back some control. He plans to push a budget resolution through the chamber that would serve as a framework for a reconciliation bill later in the spring. That bill, if it survives intact, would allow Republicans to fund ICE and Border Patrol through 2029 using the fast-track reconciliation process, which sidesteps a Democratic filibuster. Thune says even that may not be enough to avoid another stop-start autumn. He argues that Democrats are simply unwilling to sign off on robust immigration enforcement while Donald Trump remains president, and that the entire appropriations process is at risk of becoming unworkable. "I'm very concerned about the appropriations process," he said, adding that he does not see Democrats agreeing to fund ICE and the Border Patrol during Trump's term. In his view, repeated shutdowns are not a bug in the system anymore, but a tool that the opposition is prepared to use. Republicans blame Democrats for shutdown tactics under Donald Trump. Other Republican senators have been blunter still, openly accusing Democrats of weaponizing shutdowns to damage a Republican-run Washington ahead of the November elections. "You can bet on it that that's Chuck Schumer's game plan, to shut the government down at every chance he gets," said Senator Roger Marshall of Kansas. He backed passing whatever legislation necessary to avoid a fresh shutdown in the autumn, but framed Democrats as eager to embrace more chaos in order to hurt the party in power. Democrats, for their part, flatly reject the idea that they are playing games with federal workers' livelihoods. They argue that in a Washington dominated by Republicans loyal to Donald Trump, their leverage over funding bills is one of the few ways they can push for policies that poll well nationally, such as extending Obamacare subsidies or tightening rules on immigration enforcement. Still, Republicans say they see a pattern. Senator Ted Cruz, speaking on CNBC's Squawk Box, went so far as to lay down a cash prediction. "I will wager, right now, $100, that Schumer intends, on October 1st, to do the same thing, to shut the whole federal government down for a month, so that on Election Day, the government is shut down, you have 4-hour lines again in airports, and the Democrats can say, 'See, the Republicans are in charge. They don't know what they're doing,'" Cruz said. Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri echoed the suspicion, saying Democrats seem to believe that the more chaos, the better as November approaches. There is, to be clear, no formal Democratic plan on the table committing to another shutdown. The party's leaders insist they are using the tools available under the Constitution to resist what they see as damaging policy. But the mutual distrust is now so deep that many Republicans simply assume brinkmanship is coming. Inside the Republicans search for a shutdown escape hatch. Against that backdrop, Senate Republicans have begun quietly discussing structural fixes to a problem they admit has spun out of control on Donald Trump's watch. The goal is not just to win the next standoff, but to blunt the impact if talks collapse again. At a closed-door lunch on Tuesday, senators heard presentations from Ron Johnson of Wisconsin and James Lankford of Oklahoma, who are pushing rival approaches. Johnson's Shutdown Fairness Act would guarantee pay for essential federal employees who are required to work during a funding lapse. Air traffic controllers and Transportation Security Administration staff are among those who kept turning up during past shutdowns, only to receive paychecks late. Johnson argues his bill, which he says has a ton of support from federal labor unions, would prevent the kind of airport backlogs that marred last year's 43-day shutdown and this year's partial Homeland Security closure. "I'm for that, I think that's a great idea," Thune said of efforts to shield workers, adding that Republicans were seriously talking about what's the best way to execute on ensuring that at least government employees continue to get paid in the middle of a government shutdown. Lankford's Prevent Government Shutdowns Act takes a different tack. Rather than focusing on pay, it would automatically trigger 2-week stopgap funding if Congress misses its deadlines, and it would clamp down on taxpayer-funded travel for lawmakers while those temporary measures are in place. The idea is to force members to stay in Washington, working 7 days a week on appropriations until a deal is reached. "We're both trying to solve a problem," Lankford said of his and Johnson's competing plans. He acknowledged that Johnson's bill deals directly with workers' pay, which he called extremely important, but argued that it doesn't encourage us to then finish our work. Appropriators, he said, tend to favor his model because it keeps pressure on Congress rather than simply softening the blow for the bureaucracy. Any fix will have to navigate the Senate's arcane rules. Thune has floated the idea of bolting shutdown prevention language onto the reconciliation package funding ICE and Border Patrol, which would protect it from a filibuster. But that would require the Senate parliamentarian to rule that such provisions comply with the so-called Byrd Rule, which strictly limits what can pass under reconciliation using a simple majority. Republicans are also eyeing an earlier Homeland Security appropriations bill that cleared the Senate before Easter, funding most of the department except ICE and the Border Patrol. Senator Johnson has urged House Republicans to take that bill and add his Shutdown Fairness Act before sending it back across the Capitol. Speaker Mike Johnson is resisting that route for now. The Louisiana Republican has refused to put the Senate Homeland Security bill on the House floor, saying he wants to wait for the broader reconciliation measure that would lock in immigration enforcement money for the next 3.5 years. Related articles.